Hi, my name is Paul Wilson. I'm a retired Metropolitan Police Superintendent. I served in the Metropolitan Police for just over 31 years, actually, and retired in 2010. And I've done lots of things in my career, and I'm going to talk about some of them now. But I think one of the key questions for most people is, why did you join the police? Why did you become a police officer? And it's a very common question. And to understand my answer, I need to take you back. I need to take you back to my childhood, really, where I was born and on what happened. And I was born in a very rural county of Lincolnshire. On the East Coast. Many of you will not be familiar with Lincolnshire. Some of you might have heard of Skegness, which is a famous seaside resort, but generally speaking, Lincolnshire is undiscovered, particularly by people in London, because there's no reason to go there, actually. We're only famous for potatoes and cornfields, and it's a very agricultural county. And but what it does have, it's lots of military airfields, because it's a very flat county. It's very flat. So it was the base for a number of RAF bases. And with those RAF bases came a number of American bases. So my father visited Lincolnshire in the late 50s as a member of the US Air Force, and that's where he met my mother. And I came along in 1958, I'm pleased to say. And I mean, it was very unusual for Black people to be seen in Lincolnshire at that time. It's probably unusual for them to be seen anywhere, but particularly Black Americans, because Black Americans had money too. They had big cars, lots of money, because they were in the forces. And interestingly, they earned quite reasonable amounts of money, even though the forces were segregated in those days. So the Black Americans were still much better off than their Black Caribbean counterparts. So anyway, I was born in Lincolnshire, 1958, and my father and mother, unfortunately, they didn't stay together. And my father went back to the States, and I was brought up in a very kind of rural environment in Lincolnshire, and went to school in a all-white school. All my friends were white, and I had a great time, actually. I was very popular. I wasn't bad at football, which helped. So I had a great time growing up in Lincolnshire, all those wide open fields, the rivers, climbing trees, you know, it was fantastic. I wouldn't have swapped it for the world. But in my kind of, around about 10 or 11, you begin to think, no one here looks like me. No one's got my experience. Certainly no one's got my hair. No one's got difficulties combing their hair like I've got difficulties combing my hair. And where do I get my hair cut? Well, the guy in the local village doesn't really understand my hair and makes a mess of it. And when I go to the nearest town, Boston, I see, if I'm lucky, 2 or 3 people that look like me. And this sort of played on my mind, you know, almost subconsciously growing up, you know. And, you know, I suppose it was the music that really gave me a lifeline to my kind of Black identity. You know, I loved my soul music, and I really kind of immersed myself in music in those days. And that was my link with my, you know, Black American identity. And I identified with the artists at that time, you know, in the kind of the late 60s and early 70s. And it really was something that absolutely kept me going. And obviously I'm summarizing here, but it wasn't until I got into my kind of teens that I began thinking about, you know, leaving Lincolnshire, because for the life of me, I couldn't imagine settling down in Lincolnshire, because I was, you know, I wasn't lonely, but I was on my own as far as I was concerned, because I didn't see anyone that looked like me. No one had my experiences. I experienced a little bit of casual racism, but it was nothing, absolutely nothing in those days. Most people really, you know, were quite fond of me. And it wasn't until I had a white girlfriend that I experienced my first bout of real racism, when her father met me for the first time by accident and threatened to beat me up. And I was 15 at the time, and you know, that kind of brought it home that yeah, you're different, you know. But that aside, I still enjoyed living where I lived, and I enjoyed the town. And but I began exploring bigger cities, Nottingham in particular, Manchester, places like that, and I began to see more black people. I got to know where to buy my Afro comb from in Nottingham. Actually, it was a vegetable market in Nottingham. It was 50 miles from my home, and that's where I bought my first Afro comb, and I must have been 14 or 15, just turned 15, probably 14 actually, 14. So I had to go all the way on the train. When I got to Nottingham, I'd been shopping in Nottingham, but I had no idea where I could get an Afro comb, and I had to ask. And eventually someone said, well, I think the West Indians that sell vegetables on the market, I think they sell them. So I eventually found the market, and I said to this guy, I need an Afro comb. And he looked at me and he reached under his vegetable stall and he brought out this big cardboard box full of Afro combs. Well, in those days, I had a lot of hair. I had a big Afro, and I had managed up until then very poorly, actually, but always looked neat, but it was hard work. So that was all my Christmases come at once. And I was 14, probably 15 at that time. And I think, you know, it's things like that that really prompted me to think about, you know, living in a more kind of multicultural environment. And so as I, you know, moved through my teens, this, you know, weighed on my mind until, you know, I left school. I left school at 16. I got a job in a local town as an optical mechanic. It was a nice job, but boring. And I couldn't see myself staying there for too long. And I was now traveling to clubs and around the country, listening to my music, and, you know, lots of experiences, particularly, you know, girlfriends, and you would, you know, I think I need to leave this kind of sleepy rural idyll. That was beautiful and still is beautiful, but it wasn't somewhere that I wanted to grow up in. So to cut a very long story short, around about the age of 18, 19, I began looking in the papers to see what I could do that would take me out of Lincolnshire. And I was 19 years old, and I remember one day looking in the Daily Express, because my grandfather, we lived with my grandfather. He ordered the Daily Express, which was a very conservative newspaper actually, and he was a staunch Labour socialist. So I never quite understood why he ordered the Daily Express, but nevertheless he did, and thank goodness he did, because one evening I was looking through the Daily Express and this advert jumped out at me. I remember it was a portrayal of some young people, and the headline was, "Could you help us in the Metropolitan Police?" And I looked at it and I thought, what's that about? And it was very captivating. And I'd never ever considered working for the police, but I read the advert and it said something along the lines of, you know, help us we're looking for clerical assistants to work at New Scotland Yard in London. And so that was it. That had me. I was absolutely enthralled. And I looked further and I had the educational qualifications. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could apply, get the job and move to London. One small consideration I hadn't taken into account is I didn't know anyone in London. I had nowhere to live in London, and the money on offer was not fantastic. It was much, much better than I was earning in Boston, in Lincolnshire, but still, it wasn't much money. So, but nevertheless, it didn't put me off. I applied and I was invited for an interview. Unbelievably, they invited me for an interview, and the interview took place in Pimlico, which for those of you who live in London will know that Pimlico is just sort of south of Victoria. It's quite central. It's not far from kind of Vauxhall Bridge, that kind of area. And so I made my way down. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone, didn't tell friends. I was embarrassed. You know, if this doesn't work out, I mean, I'm going to be embarrassed. So I put a shirt on and a tie and a jacket, and I got on a train from Lincolnshire, from Boston down to King's Cross, and I made my way down on the Victoria line from King's Cross. I got to Pimlico tube station, and I walked to this address, and it's in Regency Street, and yeah, and I went into the reception area and introduced myself. I was so nervous, and they sort of showed me downstairs, and there was a desk and three ladies sat behind the desk, and they were so very, very chatty. It was a very informal, chatty interview, and they made me feel really comfortable, made me feel at home. I wasn't under pressure. They asked me about myself, what I like doing, and then they said, if you're successful, where will you live? And that was it. I thought, well, that's it. Where will I live? I said something like, well, if I'm successful, obviously I'll have to get a room somewhere, and and I was rambling, and and then one of the ladies said, what we do for young people like you, she said, we can put you in a hostel in central London. We have special civil service hostels where young people working for government departments will live together. And she said, they're very nice places to live, she said, and everything's subsidized, and there's hot food every day. And I was like, I was sitting there with my hands on my knees, but I was doing cartwheels, you know, cartwheels around the room, and I was nodding my head, and I was, yeah, that's interesting. That's nice. And so I went away, and I was like so thrilled. And I got home, and I still didn't say anything, and I thought, I'm going to wait until I find out what's happened. And the weeks passed by, and I think something like a month passed, and I've not heard anything. And I was so upset. And this is you've got to understand, this is 1979. We didn't have a phone at home. There's a phone box in the village. So I had to walk to the phone box in the village, and I phoned up Metropolitan Police Office to find out what had happened with my kind of interview and application. And I quickly got through to the right people, and they said, oh, Mr. Wilson, well, we did offer you a position 3 weeks ago, but we've not heard anything from you. And I'm afraid that the position, it's open, but it has to be filled next week, i.e. in 10 days time. So you would have to start in 10 days time. And I said, I'll start. And they said, well, we can put it back. And I said, no, we'll start. So will you be requiring hostel accommodation? Yes, I will. So I put the phone down, went home, walked in, and my mum was sitting in the kitchen. I also remember I said, Mum, I'm leaving home, I've got a job in London. I just blurted it all out, and she found it very difficult to take in, because I had a younger brother who had left to join the forces, the RAF, interestingly, a few months prior to me making that announcement. And but she understood, because she had seen that I was not happy in the environment, and she understood. And yes, so July 1979, I put all my worldly possessions into my trusty Triumph Herald car and drove down to London. It took me hours because I got lost. I got to the North Circular Road and I just went the wrong way. And I didn't get into Bayswater was the address of the hostel. Leinster Gardens, fantastic. I was like 200 yards from Bayswater Road, 250 yards from Hyde Park, you know. So that was my home. You know, I reached on Saturday afternoon, 5 o'clock. It was a hot July day. And I remember parking my car and this beautiful white Georgian building with kind of these decadent pillars outside. And I walked up the steps and knocked on these big double doors. And this lady came to the door and she said, "It's Paul Wilson, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, I'm sorry I'm late. I was supposed to be there at 2, you know, and it was 5. So she said, "Never mind, come in, park your car around the corner, put it on a meter and da 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 da." She said, "Have you eaten?" And that was it. And she was like, you know, she was like the matron of the establishment. And you know, we're all guys. It's all men in this kind of hostel. And it was just fantastic, you know, and what a fantastic introduction to London. You know, living just off of Bayswater Road, being able to walk over the road and play football in Hyde Park. And it was just, and, you know, 20 minutes walk and you were in Oxford Street. And with all the kind of nightlife, you know, I was 20 years old at the time. So you can imagine the change it was for me. It was fantastic. And so my introduction to New Scotland Yard took place a few days later. And I found myself working on the 11th floor in a department called the Solicitors Department. The Metropolitan Police in those days had their own solicitors, lawyers, yeah, because this was pre-CPS, yeah, this was pre-CPS. This was a time when the police prosecuted their own cases and they had solicitors to enable them to do that. So they employed the chief solicitor, the chief Metropolitan Police solicitor, who in turn employed staff, professional staff and non-professional staff. And they must have employed probably in the region of like 50 solicitors and then probably, you know, another 60 or 70 staff to assist and service the professional staff. And so I found myself clerking on the 11th floor at New Scotland Yard, which you can imagine was quite a radical change from my normal working environment, which was in a little kind of converted house in Boston where I used to put lenses for spectacles. And but you know what, I made the transition very quickly. It, you know, it didn't seem to faze me at all. I made friends. You know, I was a bit of a newbie. I was asked, I always remember, and it's in my book, being asked out at lunchtime by a group of girls who said, "Do you want to go to McDonald's?" And I said, "Was that a wine bar?" And they said, "Where are you from?" So yeah, I mean, that was my kind of introduction to kind of, but you know, even back then, even though I was very kind of you know, new to London, and I was, you know, taking in London life was it didn't faze me, but I soon noticed the difference. I soon noticed there was a stark contrast between, you know, black and white in the way that lives were lived. And although I wouldn't go as far as saying it was segregation, you know, black people to me lived different lives to the white people. I didn't work with any black people initially. And on my way to work and during my lunch break, I hardly saw any black people. This was 1979. So, black people were not employed in numbers in, offices in and around central London then. And that kind of hit me, and it was very noticeable. The next thing was the socialization of, we would go out in the evenings and what have you. And I noticed that, down at Oxford Street, a lot of the clubs, the nightclubs and what have you, were not frequented by black people. And a couple of guys at my hostel from Leicester, African Caribbean guys, we would go out and we would be refused entry into these clubs, and we would be told that, it's members only tonight, guys. And used to think, no, it's not, because we've seen, So this is the reality, and this is why, one of the reasons why house parties in the black communities were very popular, because it was very difficult, A, to find entertainment venues as black people, and B, to find entertainment venues that played music you liked, because more often than not, they didn't. So it was very popular during that time, and up until probably the kind of the mid-80s, house parties were very, very popular in black communities, the West Indian community in London. For those and other reasons, and it was a safety issue as well. People felt safe, and there were no restrictions. It wasn't expensive, and it was a very much a cultural thing. And that was an awakening for me. I would be invited to house parties and around London, and so it was a fantastic way of meeting people. But it was also, for me, an introduction into kind of the Caribbean culture, which kind of unknowingly adopted me, and it just seemed natural. It seemed that a lot of my friends were from African Caribbean communities, from Barbados and Jamaica and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, it was kind of an interesting transition period for me. But I'm still a clerk at New Scotland Yard, and I'm growing more and more interested in my job. And I'm promoted, and I become a fully fledged law clerk, which means I go to Crown Court and I sit behind the barrister as the instructing solicitor. And I thought, I want to become a barrister. So I began studying law, actually. And about 3 years in, I began to think, this is a career for me, it's good. And then I joined a gym. I joined a gym just across the road from Middlesex Crown Court. Middlesex Crown Court was the first Crown Court I worked at. And it's actually, no, Middlesex is, where's Middlesex? Actually, there's no such place as Middlesex. Middlesex Crown Court was in Parliament Square. It was that lovely Guildhall building opposite the Houses of Parliament. Beautiful, and it was a Crown Court in the late 70s and through much of the 80s, and that's where I worked. And across the road from Middlesex Crown Court, off of Parliament Square, was a very famous police station, Cannon Row Police Station. And I was told by police officers that worked at Middlesex that if I went over to Cannon Row and identified myself as a member of the police staff, I could use the gym free. So I thought, that sounds good. And that's what I did. And that's where I met some very good friends. And that really opened up to me the possibility of becoming a police officer. Because at the gym, it was mostly civilian staff like myself, but we would inevitably collide with police officers who walked through the gym, used the same changing rooms, etc., etc. And there was one particular moment that I refer to in my book, and which was a turning point for me. I was sat in the gym, and I was aware that, you know, people were getting changed, people were coming out the communal shower, and I was at the corner of my eye, I saw the guy come out of, a white guy come out of the shower wrapped in a towel. And then he said very loudly, he said, "We need to get more people in the job like you." Well, I was sort of tying my shoes up at the time, and I didn't want to enter into conversation. I knew immediately what he meant. The job was a colloquialism for the police. If you're in the police, you call it the job. All police officers to this day use that terminology. It's called the job. Are you in the job? I'm in the job. How long have you been in the job? So for him to say, we need to get more people like you in the job, I knew immediately that I was the only kind of person of color in that changing room at that particular time. So he was talking about, so I didn't want to get into that conversation, because by now I had known London enough. I'd known the workings of the police enough. Through my work in solicitors department, I knew that the police were stopping black youth in their schools, and hundreds, under the sus law. This was the suspected persons law, piece of legislation under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which was actually introduced to disperse those returning soldiers from the Crimean War. And because the middle classes felt very uneasy walking the streets at night with all these kind of returned soldiers suffering all sorts of, you know, post-traumatic disorders, stress disorders, having served in the war, but that was not recognized in those days. You were shell shocked, and many of them just couldn't handle it and became kind of vagrants. And so this legislation was introduced, a raft of legislation that helped the authorities to sort of clean up this, keep order on the streets. And anyway, it was still being used throughout the 60s and 70s by a Metropolitan Police who felt they needed to kind of stamp down on the number of black youths on the street, up to no good, as they saw it. But as I saw it, and many others saw it, it was a means of controlling black youth. And unfortunately, you know, the Metropolitan Police at that time was not free of corruption. And there were a number of corrupt officers who would kind of use the legislation to fabricate and fabricate evidence against these young black youths. And the cases would come across my desk. And so I was very familiar with all of this, and it made me very uneasy about even thinking of joining the police. So I wasn't happy entering in the conversation with this man wearing a towel. This man wearing the towel, it transpired, was an inspector, a police inspector by the name of Bell. Inspector Bell was his name. He was known as Dinger. I don't know why he was called Dinger, but he was called Dinger. That was his nickname. And Dinger had a claim to fame. During the Brixton disturbances in 1981, which resulted from the very sus law that I've been talking about, you know, essentially the black community rebelled. It had had enough. It had been over-policed, underserved, and the incidents in Brixton in 1981 involving the police and black youth, it was a tipping point. And there was kind of a 2-day riot disorder, during which time a number of police officers were injured, including Dinger Bell. Now, the difference between Dinger and the rest of his colleagues is Dinger got on the front page of the News of the World newspaper, and his face was covered in blood. Some people will remember it. It's in my book, actually. There's a photograph taken from, there's an excerpt rather taken from the News of the World. And the headline in the News of the World was "Bloody Face of Brixton." And there was Inspector Bell with blood running down his face from, he'd been struck by a brick. And anyway, a bloodied face and what have you. And yeah, and I never met him again, and I've never met him since. And I don't know if Dennis is, because that was his first name, I believe, Dennis. I don't know if he's still with us today. It's a long time ago. Somehow I think not, probably. I never met him anyway. And but he did make me think. He did cause me to think. He did cause me to think. And fortunately, there was an inquiry into the Brixton Disorders, which many people will be familiar with. The inquiry was conducted by Lord Scarman. And a number of recommendations came out of Lord Scarman, including the fact that we need more officers of colour. And also the sus law was repealed. It was repealed. By 1982 it had gone. So I thought, really, that had been the key obstacle, really, because by now I'd been working in a Crown Court and I'd been rubbing shoulders with police officers who were giving their evidence, etc., every day. And I would look at these police officers and be very critical and think, you're not very good. You know, I could give evidence better than that. Why have you not said that? You've missed this out. Da, da, da. And I became very critical. And I became very friendly with a barrister at the time who said, you know, why don't you join, if only to give better evidence, Paul, because, you know, you've been much better than this guy. So, and yeah, so one thing led to another. I mean, there were a number of other incidents that I kind of write about in my book, but yeah, I joined. I put in my application. At this time, we were talking about 1983, and I was living with my two African Caribbean friends in a flat in Brixton, just off of Brixton Hill. They did much the same as me visiting London for an interview. You know, I was always very coy about disclosing my business to anyone. And I certainly hadn't disclosed the fact that I was going to apply to join the police as a constable to my two flatmates. And well, what happened was, one evening I was in the flat with my two friends, and the door knocked, and I thought, no one knocks on our door, no one ever visits us. And then I had this kind of fear that it might be the police and it might be something to do with my application to join. So I kind of bounded to the front door, opened it, and there was an officer in full uniform, an Inspector Hambleton from Clapham Police Station. I've come to see Paul Wilson. Yes, that's me. Yes, Mr. Wilson, about your application. Yes. Well, what we do is a home visit to see your circumstances and the people that you're living with, to see whether or not it's suitable as a police officer, because we can't have police officers living just anywhere and with anyone. And that's what they did in those days. That's what they did. Unannounced home visits to assess the suitability of your home and the people that you're living with. And I said to him, wait there 1 second, because my friends don't know that I'm and you're gonna, and he said, well, I can't. He said, I've got to come in.